Chapter 14. She stood in a more colorful, more beautiful version of her father's throne room. The dais shined as though recently polished. Colorful dragons crawled up the pillars. The throne was empty. No emperor's guard lined the hall. It was just Meiling, standing alone amid shimmering memory threads. With a guttural growl that echoed through the bare space, she turned and ran out of the throne room. She flew through silk curtains and painted ornate doors. She was focused on her destination like a muagway stalking its victim. Nothing could distract her, not the tugging threads, the promise of windows or other doors. No, she had one goal. She realized suddenly that there was another shadow beside hers. She whirled, stopping abruptly. There had never been another person in her mind before. Never, ever. She ground shadowy, boneless teeth, bit fleshless lips. The shadow was gone. In its wake was a humming sort of magic. Meiling's heart picked up its pace. She hastened forward again. She should not let herself be distracted. Gold and red and white and green gleamed like flashing rainbows of color, begging her eyes to feast upon their beauty. This was her mind, after all. She had constructed this place. Or perhaps the bare bones had always existed since her birth, but she had painted and decorated it to the radiant, clean beauty that spoke of home. The only place she had ever lived until Liu Xian had been forced to kidnap her. Meiling focused, redoubling her pace. Through cavernous, exquisite halls she flew, faster and faster, until she stopped suddenly and whirled. "Who are you?" Meiling called. "Show yourself." Magic hummed where she had sensed the shadow's presence. "I know you are there."
"Do you?"
A familiar voice whispered. Her heart lurched. Her voice stuttered, caught on strings of strong emotion. Shang? Is that you?" The non-existent shadow laughed, but it was not Shang's laugh. Then again, had she ever heard Shang laugh? "Why are you here?" she demanded, wishing she did not feel suddenly wispy with weakness.
"You invited me."
Shang's unmistakable voice returned, coming from behind her. She whirled, barely catching the slightest darkness before it dissipated again in laughter and humming. "I invite no one into my mind," she growled. Before she could prevent it, a piteous mewl poured from her throat, escaping her lips and flooding her mind. "Why haven't you come for me?"
"Why would I come for you?"
That unfamiliar, strange laughter resounded again.
"You were my interruption. Your helplessness plagues me. I weary of you. I weary of saving you. Save yourself for once. Then, maybe, I shall consider you as more than an inconvenience."
Meiling jerked back, gasping with pain. His voice seeped into the floor, swallowed by humming. That humming was starting to make her ache as though she had a headache, but the sensation was different while standing in her own mind. She needed to get to the palace entrance, but as soon as she started forward, the shadow reappeared. "Go away, Shang!" Meiling cried.
"Who is Shang?"
A very different voice mumbled quietly.
"Shang, as in Tang Shangdi? Your protector?"
"Ma!" she gasped, turning and trying to grasp that shadow. It vanished between her formless hands. "Ma! Why do you run from me? I need you! I miss you!"
"May, my sweet, do not try to find me. I do not wish to be found by you."
"But why? Why, Ma?" She whirled round and round, clutching for a shred of that shadow, of that warmth and comfort. "I need you! I need your strength!"
"Do you love me only for what I can do for you?"
A knife, as real as any in the waking world, plunged into her heart. "Ma, What could you possibly mean? Of course not.
I've long known that you only love me because no one else does. Meiling, my darling, you only love those who love you. It is your greatest fault. You think you are only misunderstood. You do not consider that you, yourself, are unlovable. You think the fault is with everyone else, never you.
Everything froze for just one instant, as though her blood had halted in her veins. Then she crumpled into a pile on a red woven rug with white tassels and gold-threaded embroidery, sobbing. Those harsh words, spoken with such melting tenderness, could not have cut deeper. "Why do you weep?" A completely different voice replaced the gentle whispers of her mother. "Get up! Fight, you fool! Unless you are as weak as I have always feared you to be. Unless you cannot fight. Then you are a greater fool than the rest of us." Mirthless, bitter, biting. A cold version of Fei Yen's voice. The humming was almost overwhelming now, yet it could not drown out those insistent, crushing voices. Two spoke together. "You bring us shame, sister." A third voice, lower and stronger with a tinge of fire and smoke.
"You disappoint me, daughter. You weaken under affliction. Have you no spine, daughter mine? Will you trade all you love because you do not understand the meaning of sacrifice?"
And another.
"I can remove your disgrace before the people. No more shame."
Round and round, the voices hummed until they were buzzing, combining, twisting into a thorny crown of bloody roses. The crown pressed down on Meiling's brow, its agony falling heavy. But those were not roses that Meiling saw. They were purple, sharp-edged leaves. They dripped acid, sizzling carpet and wood in their wake. For one single instant, the humming quieted, enough for her to have one conscious thought. Get to the door. She burst into a run, tearing off the crown and flinging it into the burned rug behind her. It seemed to sputter, pop, and crackle. The humming grew louder, but the voices were now indistinguishable. Gasping through sobs, she ran and ran until she was no more than a zipping line of awareness. Black flared before her vision. She stopped just one moment before she plunged headlong into that ugly, glaring magic blocking her exit, imprisoning her. She looked down, and there at her feet was the crown she had discarded. It lay, glowing purple and black and other ugly hues for which she had no name. The crown of her worst nightmares and fears. She picked it up and ignored how it burned her flesh. She was not physical. She could not truly burn here. So she gripped it in her fist and squared her shoulders against the exit of her mind. "I can free you from your shame," the crown whispered. "From your shame, your weakness, your sins, your disgrace." With a cry of rage, Meiling swung the crown and struck the hideous bar on her mind. The blow sent her reeling backward. Sparks flared and a strange, throbbing noise banged through her awareness. She threw herself back at the barrier, wielding the crown for another strike. Again and again, she raked claws of thorns across the blackness. Again and again, she was thrown back. But this was her mind. Again and again, she got to her feet again and charged forward. Slowly, the magic shredded before her vision. Her room in Zedong's fortress clarified beyond that blocked door. The magic weakened, bit by bit. If she had to be here all night to break the spell, then she would be. She was so close. The magic was mere tatters of what it once was. But in her determination, she did not notice that the room beyond her mind grew brighter. She did not notice until the door in front of her and the thorny, poisonous crown in her hand started to blur and dim before her. That was when she blinked and looked through the door at the dawning of the waking world. That was when she opened her eyes and stared at the rafters overhead. She gazed vacantly at the ceiling, at the streaming pink sunlight. Her breathing was heavy, almost rasping. Her body was slick and dampened with sweat, her muscles quavering as though she'd run halfway across the world. Then, with a cry, she lurched upward in bed. She sprang toward the window where a single purple leaf lay, fluttering slightly in the breeze. It had blackened throughout the night, but still retained its distinctly purple hue. She pulled her sleeve lower so she could fling the leaf out into the world below, away from her, without touching it with her skin. She shuddered, covered her face with her hands, and sank to the floor. The bare skin of her calves and feet slid along the smoothed wood. What horror had she unleashed in her mind? True, she had almost broken through Zedong's enchantments. But at what cost? She had almost lost her soul to that fear. Even now, those poisonous words, spoken from the mouths of the people she loved the most, ran like dripping water through her mind, finding every porous surface to sink into. Those words found homes in her mind. Could she ever be rid of them? Could she ever look at her father and not hear his disappointment? And Shang, could she face him now, feeling his disgust? Would she be able to embrace her mother without a whisper in her ear, that nagging feeling that she would never be as good as Ma? But there was no guarantee she would ever see those people again. There was only one person who she very much intended to see again. Fei Yan. The healer, who was stronger than her. Fei Yan, who was good-hearted and yet a fighter. Those noxious words filled like a toxic perfume in her nostrils, voicing the very thing she had feared from the moment she had met Fei Yan. Would Fei Yan discover how weak Meiling actually was? Did she see it already? Day had dawned. A new day. Meiling breathed in the chill air, the warmth of the rising sun on the back of her head. She listened to the sound of her own inhales and exhales. Soft, reassuring. Notably lacking from the accusing voices had been Fen's. Was that because she had long given up on winning Fen's approval? Was it because she had already heard every unkind thing from her lips? It seemed that Fen's opinions held no sway over her, not in her heart of hearts. But Shang's did. That thought terrified her. She'd had enough terror, though. It was time to face the day. She drew herself to her feet, walked to her wash basin, and filled it with water from the pitcher. The frigid cold was a slap in the face, in a good sort of way. Meiling would not let this defeat her. She still breathed. There was still fight left in her soul. She had still accomplished a daring feat in her mind. She had wielded dark magic against itself. And she hoped she never did it again. The icy water dripped off her nose and slid down her neck. She kept her hands braced on either side of the wash basin, face bent down to stare at her own barely visible reflection. What a terrifying thing that magic was. This was why dark magic was forbidden. It was too dangerous, too destabilizing, too volatile. It was like a parasitic malady in need of curing. One could lose their soul and their life with this magic. And Zedong wanted to teach this explosive art to everyone? To anyone who was willing to work for it? Anyone who proved his loyalty to him? This power could not be wielded, not without driving the wielder to the brink of insanity. Meiling pursed her lips grimly. She had tasted of this power. She wanted no part in it, ever again. As Meiling was summoning enough courage to leave her room, she noticed a little sack on the ground by her door. She frowned and crouched before it, her blue robes trailing on the wooden floor. It was a lumpy, coarse knapsack with a bit of twine securing it shut. She pulled open the twine and let the cloth fall back to reveal 3 hard lumps of bread. No water, but even having the bread was a relief. She knew where she was going first, if she could make it there without being diverted by Zedong or his guards. Would he try to stop her this time? Maybe another day she could sneak a knife to Fei Yan. Tonight, perhaps in her sleep, she could escape the restraints he had placed on her mind, and then she could search Xu Zhen's mind for the keys to the cells, whether they were with the jailer or somewhere else. The thought of entering his mind again made her shudder, but she would do what she needed to do. Maybe she could call his memory of Fei Yan to guide her again.
Memories, my darling, are treacherous. Never trust them.
Never trust her own? Or others? This was if Zedong didn't discover how much damage she had done to his barriers. She had no idea when he placed them or how, and for all she knew, they'd be strengthened and renewed the moment her head hit the pillow. She could only imagine how furious Zedong would be if he knew she had found his garden of black magic. She needed to take this one step at a time. First, give 2 loaves of bread to Liu Xian and Tao. Then find Fei Yan and give her the 3rd. And tell her everything and ask what they could even do to escape at this point. Meiling pushed away the memories of Fei Yan's words in her mind as she shoved open her door. She tucked the bread into her skirts to hopefully evade notice. The morning was already escaping quickly as she hurried down the empty corridor, blinking when direct sunlight blasted her eyes through the windows. She tried to not walk too hurriedly, tried to walk in such a way that she appeared leisurely and graceful, without betraying how fast she was actually moving. Ma had always been good at it. Meiling had been a little less good, but certainly better than Hao. She could still hear Ma coaxing Hao to be something of a lady, to which Hao always retorted that she wasn't a lady, she was a warrior. And Ma would smile and tell her that part of being a good warrior was being a ladylike princess. Hao never was convinced. Familiar sounds of practicing battle clanged in Meiling's ears. Why were they still here, practicing? Why were they not taking over the world? Not that she was going to rush them. To her surprise, not a single person glanced her way as she walked straight toward the dungeon. There was no prickling sensation of eyes following her movements. In fact, it was almost as if... There. The shadows were a little deeper in that corner of the portico. Her awareness sparked, even as her heart lifted. Xu Zhen was helping her after all, despite the risk to himself. She opened the door to the dungeon, slipped through, and shut it behind her. Would she ever get used to the sudden blackness? Descending those stairs took even longer than yesterday. Dirt crumbled under her fingers as she braced against the wall to prevent herself from tumbling headlong. Finally, she jolted her knee when there were no more steps. She walked further and turned to see the corridor lined with doors. And the lantern she'd taken yesterday had been replaced on its hook. The jailer sat on his chair like yesterday, hands folded across his belly, staring wide awake into the passage. Please, Xu Zhen, let your illusions hold. Keep me invisible for a few minutes longer. Stomach nodding, she hurried forward, snatched the lantern off its hook, and slipped through the door that would lead to Liu Xian and Tao, without a glance toward the jailer. When the door closed behind her, she paused, waiting, expecting to hear a crash of sound as the jailer came after her. Her heart still thrummed, too scared, and she wondered when something like this would ever not scare her. But nothing happened. So she took one step, then another, into the depths of the dungeon. She loved the idea of being able to plunge into this darkness with nothing but a dying lantern and not be frightened, but she was terrified by the road that would lead her to such courage. Meiling might have been one of the most sheltered children in the Empire growing up, but even she knew that courage was forged in adversity, not in the silken sheaths of a safe, luxurious home. Soon enough, she opened a door and found herself peering into shielding hands. Liu Xian grunted. "I brought bread," she whispered, setting the lantern down quickly and stepping in front of it to protect them from the brightness of its glare. She dug around her skirts for the loaves and produced them, handing one to an eager Liu Xian who shuffled forward. "So you did bring bread," he mumbled, tearing into the food immediately. "I doubted you." "I don't blame you." She stepped past him to hand the other loaf to Tao, who hadn't moved an inch from his position yesterday. "Here," she said, holding it through the bars. He slowly lifted his head from his knees and blinked at her. He was younger than she had originally guessed, probably 30 or so. Liu Xian must be around 60, and she'd assumed Tao would be close. With a groan, Tao shifted himself close enough to take the bread. But unlike Liu Xian, he did not immediately shove it into his face. Instead, he clasped Meiling's hand tightly.
"Thank you,"
he whispered in his low voice, squeezing hard on her hand. "I wish I could do more," she said. "I hope to do more." He didn't let her hand go for several long minutes. Not wanting to deprive him of starved human contact, she did not pull away until he did. He shuffled back to his spot, pulling his knees up to his chest again, and started eating slow, savoring bites. "I can't stay," Meiling said, getting to her feet. "I cannot promise that I will come back, but I will promise that I will try. I'll do whatever I can."
"He'll stop you,"
Liu Xian muttered, picking crumbs out of his beard and popping them into his mouth.
"He won't let you help us. He'll find out." "He already knows,"
Tao said. Meiling's heart faltered.
"He knows you are here, helping us,"
Tao continued quietly, keeping his head down. His voice reverberated through the small space, bouncing back on the stone walls.
"This is the last time for a while that we will see you, Princess Meiling."
"What?" she sputtered. "What do you mean? He has not stopped me yet. I could probably come again tomorrow."
"Thank you for the kindness you have shown us,"
Tao said, firmly, with the conviction of a soul who had seen, who knew. Her heart rate increased, and a cord of dread tightened around her lungs. "Do I still have time to see Fei Yan?"
"If you hurry,"
he answered.
"They are coming."
Meiling snatched up the lantern and flew out of the room, hardly caring how loud the doors banged behind her. She tripped up 2 staircases and finally tumbled out of the last door before she turned and plunged back through a different door, this one leading to Fei Yan. Perhaps she should have thought to ask who was coming. The brigands? The guards? If it was Xu Zhen, that was one thing. If it was the red-eyed brigand who had manhandled her all the journey here, that was another. What would they do if they caught her? Part of her mind reasoned that she should be trying to escape the dungeon before they found her, but she needed to see Fei Yan. She needed to talk to a friend. Fei Yan probably needed the extra bread as well. Meiling almost pitched forward down unexpected staircases a few times before she finally flung open the last door and held up the lantern to glare in Fei Yan's face. "Grah!" Fei Yan cried, throwing up her hands. "I told you to stop shining that dragon-blasted thing in my face!" "Fei Yan?" Meiling gasped, immediately lowering the light and shutting the door behind her. "Fei Yan, are you all right?" "Meiling?" Genuine shock colored that tone. What are you doing here? Why aren't you here? Where have you been? Here, quickly, eat this. She shoved her last loaf in Fei-Yen's face. They're coming, so hurry. Who's coming? Fei-Yen asked around a mouthful. You're acting a little weird, you know that? You've almost managed to scare me. Are you all right? Are you injured? Meiling persisted, reaching through the bars and grabbing Fei-Yen's arm. I saw you struggling. Fei-Yen waved a hand. I'm fine. I do prefer the drugs to the slugs. I wake up very happy after he drugs me. Makes it a little hard to fight, but so does a pounding headache. I'll take the happiness, thank you. Why are you dressed up like someone's queen? They forgot to give you a crown. It was a genuine question, without malice, but Meiling did not fail to catch the confusion underscoring the words. I don't understand anything, Meiling blurted, and her words came tumbling out, explaining everything that had happened since they had last spoken. How she was given her own room, how she now ate with Zedong, how he bound her soul so she could not wield her magic except at his beck and call, how he forced her to hunt for information and give it to him, how he had arranged for Shu Zhen to make an illusion of her siblings to make her think he had captured them too. Meiling told her about the phoenix incinerating the escaping guard, how she had tried to visit her yesterday but could not find her before the guard and Shu Zhen came to get her. She shared about the other prisoners she had met, how there were 12 wielders in all, how Tao had said she would not see them again for a long time. I think they will prevent me from coming here at all, so we cannot plan our escape. So your strength cannot comfort me. I do not know what to do. I do not know how we are to ever escape this place. Fei-Yen had finished eating, and she gripped both of Meiling's hands in hers. Warmth flowed into her body. I found his dark magic, too, Meiling whispered. There's a garden hidden against a wall. I don't know if he uses other things too, or if it is only the plants. But whatever it is, it's... She trailed off, unable to describe the horror she'd experienced in her own mind. Sounds like you've gotten all the excitement between the two of us. Unfair, Fei-Yen said dryly. The plan is still the same. I'm going to try to overwhelm the guards so I can escape. I almost had him last time. I'll come get you and we'll climb over the wall or something. But Shu Zhen always comes to help subdue you. You cannot fight them both. And how are we supposed to climb over the wall? What will we do after we escape? And who is going to stop Zedong from doing all the horrible things he's planning to do? Stop overthinking things. Fei-Yen squeezed Meiling's hands with a little smile. Remember what I told you? Plans are for breaking. We could walk straight through the portcullis in the end for all I care. What about Liu Xian and Tao? What about the rest of the wielders? They could not all escape, could they? Meiling clung to Fei-Yen's hands, hating herself for wanting to burst into tears. Fei-Yen was the one who had been in the dungeon. Fei-Yen was the one who should be asking for comfort, not her. Yet Fei-Yen did not seem weakened in the slightest. For a long few minutes they sat there, holding hands through the bars of Fei-Yen's prison. Silent, waiting for something they did not know. Or perhaps they were simply savoring the warmth of friendship. Perhaps Fei-Yen needed more comfort than she let on. I am going to find where the keys are, Meiling whispered. I'm going to get you out. You and... She trailed off at the sound of a clanging door. Hurry! Fei-Yen jerked her hands away and gestured at the lantern. Snuff that out! Hide behind the door! Snuff it out? Meiling balked. Do it! Fingers trembling and fear roiling in her stomach, Meiling unlatched the lantern and blew out the candle with one small puff. The room plunged into darkness heavier than night. She groped for the door and barely had time to plant herself and the lantern safely behind it before it swung open and nearly banged her nose. She threw up her hands to stop it in time and hoped the guard did not notice how oddly the door swung. He was not given a chance to notice. Fei Yan immediately began hurling insults in her tongue that he most definitely could not understand. The meaning, however, was unmistakable. Another pair of boots followed him. Xu Zhen. He wasn't even waiting for Fei Yan to give the guard trouble before coming now. Perhaps if she hadn't fought so much, she could have surprised the single guard instead of contending with the guard and Xu Zhen. Already going to drug me? Fei Yan spat. Won't even let me prove I'll be obedient this time? Xu Zhen only grunted. The sound of scuffling ensued, followed by a strange bang and another grunt from Xu Zhen, and 2 pairs of heavy boots left the room. Meiling huddled in the darkness as the door banged shut. Fei Yan was so strong and so utterly outmatched. How did they stand a chance of escape? The only chance seemed to be if Xu Zhen helped them, but would he be willing to help after what he'd already done today? If Zedong knew she was down here helping the prisoners, then he would have known that someone had let her come down here. It wouldn't be hard for him to connect this to Xu Zhen. And then she'd lose her only ally. Hours passed. Probably only minutes. One never knew in a place like this. Without Fei Yan's comradeship, or even the lantern's attempts to drive away the permeating despair, this place was so much more hopeless. Surely that was why she was thinking these negative thoughts. Perhaps their possibilities would look less dire in the sunshine. Everything around was silent. She pulled herself to her feet. She knew how to get back. The dark should not make it that much more difficult, right? Apparently it could. By the time she had left the burnt-out lantern in the hallway beside the empty chair where the jailer usually was, mounted the last flight of stairs and pushed open the door, it was evening, and she was weak with hunger. The sound of battle met her ears. Chapter 15. At first, Meiling thought it was still late morning. At first, she thought Zedong's brigands were still practicing in the courtyard. But when her eyes adjusted to the painful light after hours stumbling through the dark, there were flames. Burning fire. Phoenixes flew overhead, blasting brigands on the walls. They were either incinerated immediately, or they fell with a sickening thud to the ground. Why would the phoenixes be burning Zedong's own wielders? And that was when the realization hit. These weren't Zedong's wielders. These were the Empire's wielders. These were... Meiling collapsed against the wall, suddenly overwhelmed with sheer joy and utter horror. They came for her. Pa had come to save her. They were here to rescue her. She would not have to fight Zedong, would not be his puppet any longer. But her burst of hope was soon crushed as she whipped her head around, watching countless wielders fall. They could not get over the wall, not with those phoenixes. How big was the force they'd brought? Would it be enough? How could these wielders fight the phoenixes and the barbarian guards and the enhanced magic of the brigands? What if it wasn't enough? Her instincts warred within her. Self-preservation urged her to run from the fighting and find a safe place to hide until she could be rescued. Another part of her urged her to run straight into the fray and scream for her people to save her. But one thought threw both of those options to the wind. Fei Yan! She lurched to her feet, bracing them wide as her eyes darted around the courtyard, the entrances to the towers, the brigands collecting on the battlements with their array of weapons and magic. Had Xu Zhen brought Fei Yan out of that door yesterday? Was that where the infirmary was? Before she could burst into a run, a hand gripped her arm in a painfully tight grip. She cried out and glanced up to see Zedong, his face a mask of fury.
"Take her!"
He flung her into someone's chest.
"Your life is forfeit if she dies."
His unspoken words rang in the air between them.
"Or she is rescued."
Hands closed around her elbows, lifting her back to her feet as Xu Zhen dragged her away, positioning himself between her and the fighting. "Xu Zhen!" Meiling cried, whirling on him. His grip tightened on her, almost painful. "Xu Zhen, where is Fei Yan?" His face was hard.
"To the vault."
"But Fei Yan!" She was practically screaming, and the surge of adrenaline in her blood was almost enough to strengthen her so she nearly broke free of Xu Zhen's grip.
"She doesn't matter,"
he shouted back into her face, wrestling her into submission. His words sliced Meiling's heart. Even more than his words, the look in his eyes seemed to drive a knife straight to her soul. "Yes, she does!" Meiling cried. "You know she does!"
"What I know doesn't matter."
All her fight fled her limbs. She did not want to give up. She did not want to leave Fei Yan to be caught in the crossfires of battle. But really, would Zedong let harm befall her? Surely she was on her way to the vault as well. Meiling should not be afraid for her. A scream cut through the din of battle. It broke off abruptly. That was it. Meiling roared, twisting with all her might, and wrenched free. Xu Zhen tried to pounce on her again, but she was running. She ducked into a stairwell and raced upward into a throng of guards. She had the element of surprise and managed to squeeze through them before Xu Zhen could follow and sound the alarm, before the guards could realize what was happening. She emerged on the battlements, opposite where the brigands and phoenixes defended their fortress. A few wielders were starting to break through. One phoenix was shot down, trailing a bursting explosion of sparks, followed by another. Maybe there was hope. She raced as fast as she could, afraid that at any moment Xu Zhen could slam open the door and chase her down. For the moment, and that moment only, she had a head start on him. She flung open the door to the next tower, hardly caring how she practically fell down the stairs, straight into the burly chest of a barbarian guard. His hands closed like claws around her arms as he shouted something in Butagan to the guards with him. Meiling yelped, trying to scramble back to pry her arms free, but his hold was unbreakable. In a second, more guards swarmed around her, unfamiliar words sailing in furious tones over her head as the first guard grabbed the back of her neck, squeezing painfully as he dragged her down several stairs. She dragged in short, shallow gasps of air, her whole body tense as a rod with his hand on her neck. If he squeezed even a little bit more... Her foot slipped on the stairs. The guard reacted, tightening his hold on both her arm and her neck. Black colored the edges of her vision as she screamed. The nearest guard's head swiveled toward her, his beard and bushy eyebrows contorted. Then there were arrows, protruding from that head. Blood spewed everywhere. Horror rendered Meiling utterly immobile, and she couldn't even brace herself before she was slammed face first into the stone wall of the tower. Pain, shouting, so much pain. That horrible hand hadn't left the back of her neck, forcing her into the wall. The shing of a blade behind her. They were going to kill her, weren't they? Then, one voice cut through the din around her. A language she knew. A voice she knew. Its tone, however, was completely unfamiliar. It was snarling, low, lethal.
"Get your hands off her."
Thwump! A startled cry sounded from just behind her. The hand gripping her neck fell away and kept falling down the rest of the stairs. Meiling's vision swam, full of stone and black spots. It ran down her face, her clothes, and she didn't know if it was hers or someone else's. Somehow, she managed to twist. Her foot stumbled to the next step, but she threw out her arms and caught herself, dragging her eyes open and blinking against the darkness. Just as a sword plunged straight into the chest of another guard. A foot landed on the chest, shoving the body backward as the crimson-stained blade was yanked back. Then a hand grabbed her arm, dragged her up half a dozen steps, and deposited her in a heap. Her rattled mind tried to catch up to what was happening as she blinked and blinked, struggling to make the world swim into focus. At last, moving shapes coalesced into people. And there was Shang. She'd recognize him anywhere. The long black queue, the broad shoulders, the trim and muscular body, the cut of his sharp jaw. His back was to her, his sword flashing in a deadly arc against the remaining barbarian guards. 4 bodies already littered the stairs, blood dripping down the walls, pooling on the stairs. Then Shang whirled toward her, black eyes flashing as he yanked his jian out of his holster, lifted it, and fired it straight over her head. Meiling didn't even have time to scream before a guard she hadn't seen coming up behind her fell, 2 arrows protruding from his neck. She scrambled away from the body, her heart pounding so hard she didn't have room for a rational thought. She pressed her sleeve to her nose, wiping away blood. Away, away, away. She had to get out of the screaming nightmare. Abruptly, it stopped. Only one man still stood amid all those bodies and all that gore. He turned. Black eyes met hers. Time froze. His mouth was drawn in a tight, grim line, his jaw clenched, his face spattered with blood. The blade in his hand dripped. He wore full armor, the plating dented and dulled already, which only served to make him more terrifying in that moment. She could do nothing but stare, her body sagging against the stone wall. He came for me. Then he was kneeling before her, prying away her hand from her face. The cold, lethal glint was gone, instead replaced by wide, half-frantic eyes.
Meiling! 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 Hey, look at me. Yes, that's a good girl. Stop touching your face. Let me see it.
The moment she let her hands fall to her lap, he hissed between his teeth. With a quick rip, he tore the end off her sash and leaned in close. He cupped the back of her head in one hand, his jaw flexing, as he dabbed away the worst of the blood. She was just staring at him stupidly, expecting him to vanish at any second. Suddenly, he grabbed his jian, shot up to his knees, and fired behind Meiling. A sharp cry. Faster than thought, he reloaded. Shot again. Reloaded. Shot. Thumps followed each shot. This wasn't happening. Shang bowed over her again, breathing hard. He laid his palm over her nose and sinuses, and the familiar ice of his touch soothed something deep inside her. He was saying something.
Gotta keep moving. I'm getting you out of here. Once you're out of the fortress, our warriors can pull back. Can you hear me? Meiling, look at me. Look at me.
She blinked. His handsome face was lined with blood, sweat, and desperation, one of his wide hands gripping the back of her head, fingers tangled in her hair. His other hand still iced her face. "Shang?" she croaked.
Yes? What is it?
His eyes seemed to swallow her whole, and for a second, she wasn't here in Zedong's tower, surrounded by bodies. Instead, she was in a cave, Shang's arms around her, his breath on her forehead. She was safe. She reached up with one tentative hand and brushed a stray lock of hair out of his face. His eyes widened. "You came back for me." His expression hardened. He pulled away from her, taking the blood-soaked piece of sash and wrapping a chunk of ice in it.
Of course I did,
he growled, pressing the ice into her hand and guiding her hand to her face.
Hold this here. You're still bleeding. It's a miracle your nose isn't broken. But you might have a concussion from that hit. Come on, we need to get out of here before it's too late. I know you're in shock, but we must keep moving."
With that, he grabbed her under her arms, hauled her to her feet, and tugged her down the stairs after him. She clung to his elbow, her knees shaking as she tried to dodge around all the bodies. Arms and legs sprawled in puddles of viscous crimson. It was so... They'd been alive mere minutes ago. Now they were gone. Dead. How many children were orphans now? How many women left as widows?
"Don't look,"
Shang growled, as though sensing the panic bubbling up inside her.
"Close your—"
He shoved her against the wall before he could finish his sentence. She hit the stone hard, a gasp choking her, as a Butagan soldier burst through the door at the base of the tower, yelling and running up the stairs toward them. Shang's bloodied sword flashed as he grunted. His free hand flung back, covering Meiling's eyes just before his sword made contact with the soldier. He couldn't block the sounds, however. The clang of metal on metal, the swoosh of air, the abrupt severing of a cry, a horrid thump that continued thumping down the flight of stairs. Was that sound a head? Did Shang just decapitate someone? His hand whipped back from her, no longer obscuring her vision of his flint-like jaw and blood-spattered cheek. His shoulders prevented her from seeing most of the body, but he yanked a loaded jian from its holster at his hip.
"Close your eyes,"
he growled, aiming the weapon with his left hand up the staircase. She didn't, and was granted the horrifying sight of arrows hitting another guard she hadn't seen. He fell off the staircase, and Meiling barely slammed her lid shut before he hit the lower level with a nauseating thud. Shang reloaded and holstered the weapon in half a second. Then he scooped an arm around her legs, lifting her straight off her feet as he ran down the rest of the stairs. She wrapped both arms around his neck, burying her face in his shoulder as he made a jostling leap. Maybe she was in shock. Death cries and clashing weapons rang in her ears, smothering every rational thought. She was a tiny child, helpless, unable to fight, unable to even keep herself alive. Shang squeezed her tightly, and his voice in her ear was strained, but still steady.
"We're at the door. I need to put you down because I don't know what it looks like out there. Stay close to me. I swear I won't let anything happen to you. I swear it. Just trust me and do as I say. Understood? Meiling?"
She nodded against his neck, felt his thick swallow against her forehead. Then she was on her own feet, Shang's sharp eyes roving over her face. A muscle in his cheek flexed before he turned away, unholstering his jian so he held it in his left hand, his broadsword in his right. She pressed her palms against her ears, then her temples, shaking her head. "Snap it together, Meiling! Snap it together! You need to survive this! Be alert!" The words didn't magically make the fog disband from her brain, but she still managed to not scream when Shang flung open the door and ducked behind the wall. His arm guarded her body against the stone, preventing her from moving into the opening. When no phoenix fire or arrows came shooting through the doorway, Shang leaned out. Just as quickly, he pulled back, chest heaving. "Is it that bad?" Meiling asked. He glanced down at her. With the edge of his sleeve, he brushed a trickle of blood away from her face.
"I will get you out of here."
So yes, it was that bad.
"Get ready to run," he growled. "You can hold on to my belt if you need to, but not my arms. I need full range of motion."
Her numb fingers wrapped around his leather belt, between his jian holster and a knife sheath, her heart beating so fast she was afraid she'd simply drop dead from sheer terror.
"Now!"
Shang bolted through the door, whipping Meiling after him as she tried not to let go. A blast of heat rolled over her, smoke clogging her nose and eyes as shouts and screams ripped through the air left and right. They'd hardly made it a few paces before Shang's blade rang against an enormous battle axe. He deflected the blow, lifted his jian, and shot the Butagan soldier before he had a chance to recover. Then they were running again, Shang frantically reloading and Meiling gasping for air. Suddenly, a name flashed through her mind. Fei Yan. Chapter 16. Fei Yan. That name shone like a beacon into Meiling's stunned senses. Fei Yan was here. Fei Yan was in trouble. What had Shang said just moments ago? That once they got Meiling out of the fortress, they could retreat? No. No. She couldn't leave Fei Yan behind. She wouldn't. And what about the rest of the captured wielders? Would they be left behind to rot in their cells? They were dying. At least one was already dead. Meiling couldn't live with herself if she fled this fortress, thinking only about herself, and leaving behind the others. Finally, her mind cleared enough for her to see through the smoke obscuring the fortress and take stock of their situation. Dead bodies from both sides littered the main courtyard. Black scorch marks pocked the ground, the walls, as phoenixes flew overhead, incinerating Junning High warriors with deadly flames. Battles waged everywhere, and it was almost sickening how few Butagan soldiers were still standing, unarmed with magic as they were. Zedong had lied, hadn't he? He'd lied to the people of Butagan, manipulated them with unfulfilled promises as he maneuvered his way into power. He claimed his magic was for everyone, and yet he withheld it so starkly from the very people he claimed to be fighting for. Now it was their bodies lying on the ground, while the brigands fought on. It wasn't just Junning High that needed saving from Zedong. It was also Butagan. From her vantage point, she could have sworn that between clouds of smoke, those were vines at the far end of the fortress, wrapping around warriors and squeezing while they tried desperately to hack them off. Was Zedong forcing Tuan to use his magic? Or... Meiling ducked behind Shang just as something came flying in the air toward them. He cursed, flinging her further out of the way as a fireball crashed into the wall behind her.
We need to get to that tower ahead of us,
Shang said, between firing and reloading his jian.
It's the retreat point. Our wielders should have held the spot so we can get over the wall.
Meiling was almost sprinting to keep up with him, dodging around bodies and struggling to breathe. Shang, Fei Yan is still here, and the rest of the wielders. We have to get them out. Wind rushed in her ears, blowing her hair out of her face. She looked up. A phoenix flew straight toward them, a streak of fire against the darkening sky, eyes like charcoal fixed on Shang. But then they shifted to her, and Meiling's world tilted. It was obviously bound to Zedong through black magic, and yet there was something more in that gaze. Something more than a curse. Something that called to the depths of her soul and resonated with her heart. It wanted to be free. That snapping beak opened. She hit the ground hard, a snarling curse in her ears as a heavy, muscular body pinned her. A wave of intense heat blasted over her as Shang rolled them both out of the way. It took her mind a few hiccuping heartbeats before she realized what was happening, that she clung to Shang as he kept rolling, that it was the frame of his jian digging painfully into her shoulder blades. Finally, they came to a stop, Shang on top of her, his chest heaving in time with hers beneath his breastplate.
Your lack of self-preservation instinct will be the death of me.
She stared up into his face as beads of sweat trailed down his forehead, his temple, and said stupidly, I'd be dead if you weren't here.
That's what terrifies me,
he growled. A second later, his head whipped up, another vicious curse springing from his lips. He yanked his jian up, bracing his knees on either side of her as he cradled her head to his chest.
Hold still, princess.
She squeezed her eyes shut, tasting copper on her tongue as the sharp twang of the jian sounded in her ears. A muted cry followed the shot. Enemy, 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 Meiling told the part of her that wanted to cry. It couldn't drown out the louder voice that insisted, human, human, human. A brutal killer held her in his arms right now, protecting her. She was the reason he killed. It both comforted her and utterly shocked her the violence Shang was capable of. And in this moment, when he held her to his chest while he dealt another death blow, she couldn't be more aware of that juxtaposition. But all this bloodshed was Zedong's fault. Not Shang's. Not Butagan's. Zedong's. He had to be stopped. Someone had to tell him this was enough. Someone had to stand up to him. But who? Who was strong enough? Who dared? Pa could, if he was even here. Shang could, if he wasn't so busy trying to keep her alive. Shang's hand slid to her waist, sweeping her up with him as he rolled to his feet. His gaze darted left and right through smoke, his eyes frantic every time he glanced toward the tower they were trying to reach.
I'm going to get you out of here.
He said it through gritted teeth, as though trying to convince himself it was still possible. Meiling's gut dropped to her feet. A shadow fell over them, wind pummeling hard. She didn't have to look up to know another phoenix, or perhaps the same one, barreled toward them again. Shang grabbed her arm, broke into a run, and yanked her after him into a small stone building along the fortress wall. He pulled her inside just before fire hit the pavement. Meiling blinked against the sudden darkness of the enclosed space, her nostrils filling with the scent of oil, soot, and iron. She screamed. Shang, who seemed to have lost his broadsword, shoved her aside and dodged out of the way of a falling axe. Meiling hit the ground and scooted backward, scrambling to get away as Shang threw himself bodily at the enemy in the darkness. Scuffling boots and grunts filled the small space, followed by a loud crash. She groped for something, anything, and her hands closed around what seemed like an iron poker. She shoved up to her feet, holding the poker in front of her as a crack split the air. Something caught the sparse light, ice, before it plunged into soft flesh. A body hit the ground. Silence. Shang? It was half whisper, half whimper.
I'm here,
came a low voice from behind her. She whirled, dropping the poker with a clang. She couldn't control herself, couldn't stop her legs from running, her arms from opening. And then she'd flung herself straight into his chest, her cheek pressed against his breastplate as she shuddered in this small, terrifying space that was almost a refuge from the storm outside. Shang! 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 She gasped, choking on tears, clinging desperately to him. Slowly, one of his strong arms came around her, pressing her closer.
We can't stay here. We have to get out.
But are you hurt? You've been fighting so much.
Don't worry about me. Slow down your breaths. You're hyperventilating.
She stared up at him, at the face she couldn't see in the darkness. And then she burst into tears, crumpling. I can't go with you, Shang. Fei Yan is still here. We have to help her. I can't leave her behind. He'll kill her if we don't. He'll kill them all. Two firm hands gripped her shoulders, giving her a gentle shake.
Meiling, stop it. Stop it. You need to hold it together just a little bit longer. Be strong for me. Please.
Did his voice just break?
I know this is the most terrifying thing you've endured, but you must stay strong until I get you out of here. Then you can cry all you want. Understood? Meiling, can you promise me this?
A sob racked her entire frame, and she shook her head. You're not listening. I can't leave Fei Yan. His grip on her tightened, turning to ice.
We can't save Fei Yan. But we must save you before it's too late. Your powers in Zedong's hands mean the destruction of our entire empire. I have to get you out, even if it means leaving others behind.
A terrible cold washed down Meiling's spine. Was this why Shang had come to save her? Why Pa had sent an army to rescue her? Because her magic was too great a threat? Not because they cared for her? Would they have left her behind with Fei Yan and the rest if her magic had been different? Or if she hadn't had magic at all? You came for me.
Of course I did. Because I'm one of the only people who knows the danger you are to Junning High.
She didn't want to believe it. She didn't want to. But she couldn't convince herself it wasn't true. Since she'd been dragged through that portcullis, everything she'd believed was questioned, thrown into doubt. Maybe she'd been slammed into that tower wall harder than she realized, because she couldn't make any sense of the thoughts careening through her head. What if those words spoken in her mind while she'd wielded black magic were truer than she'd been willing to admit at the time? Was her naivete and hopefulness not allowing her to see the obvious reality around her? She was a stupid girl who dreamed of the moment Shang would come and save her because he cared for her. She'd just made a fool of herself, throwing herself into his arms as if he wanted her there. And maybe, just maybe, he did. But had he given her any reason to believe that? Not truly. She couldn't be the weeping princess during a battle, hiding away in a little hole, begging for comfort from one of her father's warriors. Fei Yan needed her. Meiling stepped back from Shang, drawing in a deep breath, and wiped away her tears with the back of her filthy sleeve. She probably only succeeded in smearing blood across her face. Nevertheless, she lifted her chin in the darkness, ignoring her own traitorous sniffle and the way her voice quivered. Tang Shangdi, as your princess, I order you to help me find and free Fei Yan. 2 heavy booted footsteps, and then Shang's breath ghosted across her face, making her hands spasm.
I don't take orders from you. Not ones that go directly against His Imperial Majesties. Don't you realize that this entire rescue mission is about you? And the longer you don't cooperate, the more lives are being lost? For you?
Those stupid tears threatened once more, her heart twisting in a bitter knot. But it shouldn't be just about me. There are so many others.
If you cared about others, you'd come with me. Right now.
Help me, Shang. Help me find her and I'll come. Please don't ask me to abandon. He caught her chin in an iron grip, forcing her face up toward his. Another warm breath washed over her skin, and she thought she might break in two.
Don't make me tie you up and throw you over my shoulder like a sack of rice. Because, Meiling, I will do it. We don't have time to argue about this. We need...
The door swung open. Meiling whirled, a scream dying on her lips. There, framed in the light of the dying sun and fire, was Xu Zhen. Shang had already unholstered his jian and taken aim. No! Meiling shrieked, throwing herself bodily into Shang's arm, knocking his shot wide as arrows careened through the open doorway.
Meiling!
Shang shouted furiously, betrayal staining his tone. But she was not about to let him kill the only ally they had inside this fortress. She wrestled with his arm, struggling to keep her hold as he fought to pry her off without hurting her.
Come with me, Highness, and he won't die,
said Xu Zhen, his tone roughened.
She's not going anywhere with you,
Shang snarled. With that, he twisted her wrist, forcing her to break her hold, and shoved her behind him. "Where is Fei Yan?" Meiling cried, scrambling back up and throwing herself at Shang when he lifted his jian again, ignoring his curses.
The battle is over.
Those words were spoken with the finality of a death blow. Meiling staggered, and it was enough for Shang to grab her, twist her wrists behind her, and yank her face first into his side. His hand gripped her wrists like shackles, his arm pinning her to him, restraining her so she couldn't stop him when he lifted the jian and aimed straight for Shu Zhen's face. "Don't kill him!" Meiling screamed as he fired. The arrows whizzed straight through the illusionist's face into the world beyond. The image went fuzzy around the edges and then sharpened once more. Shang's body slackened with realization. He turned horrified eyes down to Meiling, and it was like she relived that moment in the valley before Lia Fugan all over again. Because she saw the very moment he realized Shu Zhen hadn't lied. The battle was over, and they'd lost. A loud bang echoed through the small space. Shang's eyes shuddered. His grip on her laxed. He crumpled to the ground. Meiling screamed, bending over him, searching for signs of wounds, for signs of life, his name echoing against the stone all around her, over and over again. Strong hands grabbed her arms, hauling her to her feet, ignoring her screams, and she barely registered it was the real Shu Zhen, or that he'd set the flat of his blade on the ground. Her vision was too full of Shang's collapsed form, his closed eyes. She twisted, tears streaming down her face, trying to break Shu Zhen's hold on her as he dragged her out into the courtyard. "Did you kill him? Is he dead? Don't let him die! Please, please, Shu Zhen, I beg you! He can't be dead! I can't lose him! Shang! I did this. I did this. I did this. He's dead. I killed him." She tried to save one and killed the other in the process. Killed and doomed them both. In that moment, Meiling hated herself more than she'd ever hated anything in her entire life. More than being a societal outcast because of a lie. More than Fang Zedong. She was never getting out of this fortress. No one would stop Zedong. Her loved ones would never be safe. She would be the death of them all.
Allow me this mercy,
Shu Zhen whispered to her between her screams. Before she processed what was happening, he pressed a cloth over her mouth and nose. Sweetness exploded across her senses. Her head went light as a cloud. Then, everything went black.